NTNU. I have the privilege of moderating this discussion, where we are going to confront a very big question, namely, what is the relationship between science and religion? Throughout history, humans have attempted to understand, explain, and come to terms with the universe and our place in it. Both science and religion attempt to tell us something significant about this, but they have an ambivalent relationship. Do science and religion operate in independent domains? Do the differences between them indicate that there is conflict, or can they be seen as offering complementary answers to similar questions? And what, in fact, is the best way to describe these two very significant human practices? And to discuss these issues, we are very privileged and honored to have with us three very distinguished participants. Our first participant is Katarina Pajchel, who is an associate professor at the Oslo Metropolitan University, where she does research in science education at the Department of Primary and Secondary Teacher Education. Professor Pajchel is a proficient researcher who has contributed to a large number of studies and who has worked with experimental physics at the particle accelerator at CERN in Switzerland. Pajchel is also a Dominican sister, a member of the Catholic Dominican order, and she lives in the St. Katarina convent in Oslo. Professor Pajchel has for many years been interested in the relationship between science and religion and participated in public events about this topic. And secondly, Varadaraja Raman is the Emeritus Professor of Physics and the Humanities at the Rochester Institute of Technology in the United States. He is a physicist and a philosopher who has authored many articles and books, which include Truth and Tension in Science and Religion, Science and Religion, Frameworks and Perspective, and Ubiquitous God, the God idea everywhere in human culture. Professor Raman has written extensively on the intersection between Hinduism and science, and he is an active member of organizations that build bridges between science and the humanities, and he has been a frequent guest on the PBS series Closer to Truth. He's also the recipient of the Outstanding Educator Award by the American Association of Higher Education. And finally, Professor Anthony C. Grayling is the Master of the New College of the Humanities in London, and its Professor of Philosophy. He is a supernumerary Fellow of St. Anne's College, Oxford. And Professor Grayling is the author of over 30 books of philosophy, biography, and history of ideas. One of his books, which is relevant to our topic today, is called The God Argument. Professor Grayling has been a columnist for The Guardian, The Times, and the Prospect magazine. He has twice been a judge on the Booker Prize, and he is, among other things, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and the Royal Society of Literature. As the Vice President of the Humanists UK, Patron of the Defence Humanists, and an Honorary Associate of the Secular Society. We are very honored to have all of you to participate in this event. And the structure of this event is as follows. First, I invite each panelist to give an opening statement of about 7 minutes on the topic of science and religion. And then we will have a 35 minutes long panel discussion, followed by a Q&A session where the panel takes questions from the audience. And to the audience, you can submit your questions by following the link to the Google Forms in YouTube or Facebook. and then I will read those questions to the panel. And you can choose if you would like to address your question to a specific participant, or if you would like to just address the panel, and then it's up to the panel to answer that question. So then I invite each panelist to give their opening statement on the topic of science and religion. And I invite first Katarina to give her statement, then Varadaraja, and finally Anthony to give his statement. So then please, Professor Pajchel.
Thank you very much. So it's a huge topic, of course, but I think these introductory statements will be just an introduction to a discussion later on. So, I will start with an anecdote. Øystein Elgerøy, professor of astrophysics, was once asked if science would replace religion. And he answered, no, nobody will come to my lectures to get married or to baptize their children. In my lectures, they sleep. So this is one way of stating that natural science and religion has a very different scope. And historically, one could claim that there has been times when religion provided some explanation or aspirations of control over natural phenomena, which we currently clearly consider as the domain of science. But this required a process of clarification of roles and domains of knowledge. So scientific and religious knowledge is related to very different methodologies, and they answer different questions. And as a first order approximation, one could say that it's the division of the scientific how and the religious why. And we acknowledge also that these two human enterprises, science and religion, play very different roles in people's lives. We may point to the very fact that that faith is more of an existential experience or commitment based rather on relation than on knowledge. Others will point to the very different languages which we meet in science and in religion. And I think that many conflicts, or what we consider as conflicts between science and religious, arise when we don't respect these appropriate questions and methodologies, and of course their limitations. There are attempts to offer scientific answers to religious questions, and the other way around.
Her sound, the sound, I'm sorry, Katarina. Hennes lyd forsvant. I cannot hear. I'm sorry, I cannot hear you, Katarina. Lyden hennes ble borte.
Så skickar jag redan till pouvoir sitter där.
Jeg kan ikke høre henne. Okay.
Is this better now?
Yeah.
Yes, that's better. Yeah.
Okay, that was, yeah, I didn't do anything. So could somebody just help me where I disappeared?
So, yeah, you were 2 minutes ago. You were talking about, I mean, you
different languages.
Okay.
Yeah, the languages.
Okay. So, so thank you. So one of the areas where we also can see the difference between science and religious is the language they use, and I think that many of the conflicts, or what we consider as conflicts between science and religion, arise where we mix the questions, where we try to offer scientific answers to religious questions and religious answers to scientific questions, or questions that potentially can be solved by science. So, which means that and I think both are equally questionable, and it also means that I'm critical towards directions as creationism and intelligent design. But can we go beyond this useful but maybe not very interesting clarification? What characterizes science and religion as knowledge? Are they indeed so different, or are there areas where they may interact? So we are becoming more aware that science as method is not this machinery which produces automatically objective and true knowledge just by itself. We know that theory and observation interplace. We know that judgments of elegance, economy, as well as beauty plays important role. Intuition and search for simplicity guides the way. The fundamental theories of today's physics are, for example, based on very deep mathematical notions of symmetry and geometry.
So 2 more minutes.
Yep. So faith, on the other side, is often associated with the subjective or even irrational. But if we look at theology, this systematic attempt to formulate religious knowledge, it is also a basis which one could say is intersubjective. Many people point to 3 sources: revelation, tradition, and third, and often underestimated and forgotten, reason. Theological statements and systems are just as much a subject of discussion, criticism, and development. And in such discussions, some of the signs of quality are coherence. There must be the statements must hang together, so to speak. There is a search for economy, a kind of simplicity, adequacy, which means that the systems must be sufficiently rich and that they have an existential relevance, which means that they are linked to the religious experience. So these indicate that theology also follows rules which have some similarities with science. And most important, I think science and theology has a common goal: to seek understanding. So both in religion and science, we may be puzzled by the intelligibility of the subjects, and why beauty, simplicity, and this longing for understanding may guide our search. So I think this could be a place where we can possibly look for interesting and relevant points of interactions. And I think I will stop there and hope that this could be an opening for further discussion.
Thank you. And now I invite Professor Raman to give his statement.
Yes, good evening. The human mind is confronted with 3 kinds of mysteries, which I call trivial, significant, and grand. Trivial mysteries are of personal interest. Why has not my friend answered my letters? Where is the key I placed on this table? These mysteries can be very simply resolved. But significant mysteries relate to natural phenomena. Why is the sky blue? Why do eclipses occur? What causes a pandemic? Well, science tries to tackle these significant mysteries. Grand mysteries relate to the human condition. Why are we here? What happens to us when we die? Does life have meaning? Why do some people suffer more and enjoy less than other people? There are two ways of responding to grand mysteries. One is to provide definite responses. Every religion is a clearly articulated framework for resolving grand mysteries and is associated with recommendations for actions in that framework. Another reaction to grand mysteries is to silently contemplate on them in awe, reverence, and humility. This is what I call spiritual experience. The goal of science is to provide consistent, coherent, and rational answers to significant mysteries. For this, it utilizes a set of techniques which include careful observation, experimentation, concepts, and clearly defined terms. It also develops and uses instruments to enhance and sharpen our sensory perceptions, measuring devices, and mathematics. The objective knowledge thus acquired is actually collective subjectivity. Those who adopt this methodology agree upon the findings of science, which are always tentative answers to questions acceptable on the basis of our current information on the phenomenal world, when there is consensus among those who are dedicated to a specialized field of science. Religions are based on revelations, not inquiries. Revelations are answers to grand mysteries that charismatic individuals, often referred to as prophets, elders, or sages, proclaim on the basis of what they report as communication from an inscrutable supernatural source. Revealed religious knowledge does not arise from a methodological inquiry, but either from deep reflections by or from an unexpected revelations to extraordinary individuals in history. Scientific methodology and religious inquiry do not compete any more than cooking food and enjoying music do. Each has a different purpose. It is like playing soccer or chess, each with a different set of rules. For science, the only eternal truths are the laws of nature that include, on ultimate analysis, how matter energy in space-time behave qualitatively and quantitatively, and the fundamental constants dictating the overall features of perceived reality. For religion, eternal truths are related to the creator of the universe as well as the present and future of individual human beings. Science and religion are two of the most sophisticated expressions of the human spirit. They are linked in so far as both emerge from the human mind, but are the fruits of conscious recognition of our presence in a vast, cold, and apparently indifferent stretch of space in the infinity of time. Our sensory perceptions have two effects on our bodies. One is to provide us with knowledge about the world through light and sound, smell, taste, and touch. But these perceptions also lead to experiences, the glory of a beautiful sunset, the joy of hearing good music, the fragrance of flowers, the taste of honey, and the feel of silk. The knowledge aspect provokes questions as to how aspects of the world arise. That leads to science. The experiential aspect provokes questions of meanings and values. The ephemeral nature of the experience and how it can be shared. These lead to religion. Both science and religion enrich us in significant but different ways. Science makes our knowledge firm, reliable, and universal. Religion makes our lived experiences meaningful, joyful, and share-worthy. Science prompts us to study the universe as outsiders. Religions enable us to be participants in the universe, drawing us to the cosmos, to the cosmic participant whom religions called God, and of which each of us is a spark. Science tells us that our bodies are made up of stellar dust. Religions remind us that our experiencing dimensions, namely our consciousness, comprise of cosmic dust. Science can raise us to our highest epistemic potential. Religions can raise us to the highest experiential potential. Ironically, they both also have the potential to demean and degrade the human condition on the planet. That is why we need to reflect on what science and religions are all about. Such reflections are neither science nor religion. They constitute philosophy, and that is what we are doing here today.
Thank you very much. And please, Professor Grayling.
Thank you, Halvor. It's interesting to me that the Professor Raman and Sister Katarina both have given very post-Enlightenment answers to the question of the relation between science and religion. Fundamentally, that they address different domains of interest and that they're not in competition with one another over, for example, questions about the nature and origins of the universe as investigated by the natural sciences. Of course, this hasn't always been the case. Indeed, it is very much a kind of post-Enlightenment, post-17th, 18th century phenomenon, this view about the relationship. Because until that time, science and religion were competitors in this domain. And indeed, the major religious organizations endeavored to try to stop the advance of scientific empirical thinking about the nature of the world, a very familiar point. And indeed, there are still some people committed to a religious outlook who today deny evolution, for example, in biology, or who oppose certain kinds of scientific research, for example, in human fertility and stem cell research and the like. So the conflict between the scientific worldview and the religious worldview can still continue in that way, although, as both Sister Katarina and Professor Raman have illustrated, there is now a kind of majority or consensus view among people of more sophisticated outlook that these are two different domains of endeavor, two different languages being spoken, two different ways of relating to the universe. Of course, the truth of the matter is that religious views, that is, views that impute the presence and activity of supernatural agencies of some kind in the universe or in association with the universe in some way, is a form, or was a form, of proto-science. Our very earliest ancestors, in attempting to understand the occurrence of natural phenomena, had one resource at their disposal, and that was their own experience as agents. You can pick up a stone and throw it into a pond, it makes a splash, so you were the causal agency behind that. So when you speculated about the thunder and the lightning and the rain and the wind, it was very natural to impute that to agency. And so the idea of beings of some kind, of great powers, some of them invisible, some visible, like the sun, for example, in Egyptian religion, was a very natural step. And the relationship between people and these agencies, perhaps suggested by the experience of dreams or hallucinations in a feverish state or whatever, suggested a kind of proto-technology, that if you could influence these agencies by prayer or rituals or observing certain kinds of taboos, you might get them to help you by bringing rain in the drought or defeating your enemies and the like. it's the young religions of the world, which are now very influential in the world, that is Christianity and Islam, which have progressively, and especially since the Enlightenment in the case of Christianity, but which have progressively placed more and more emphasis on the moral and aesthetic aspects of religion and religious outlooks, as the great effectiveness of the scientific worldview has established itself as functionally dominant in our world. I mean, here we are using Zoom on the internet, using computers and so on. We rely on the development of vaccines to deal with the current pandemic and the like. So functionally speaking, everybody accepts that science has at least quite a few answers about the nature of our world and how to deal with it. And therefore the emphasis starts to move towards the aesthetic and the moral aspects of experience. And we've heard both Sister Katarina and Professor Raman emphasize those. And yet it's the case that for people who don't have a religious outlook, for example, myself, I'm a humanist, and humanism is an ethical outlook which premises itself on the idea that we must treat our fellow human beings with as much sympathy and generosity and care as we can. I mean, subject, of course, to the fact that people who do harm, people who do bad things, we can't be too generous to them always. We must demand of our fellows, as we demand of ourselves, that we treat our neighbors in the world well, and indeed that we treat our world well. But for a humanist, the aesthetic and moral experience can be every bit as rich. I mean, after all, music and the beauties of nature, our friendships, our love, being loved and giving love, these are things that feed us as human beings. And these aspects of us, which are aspects that the religions address also, or they claim to indeed. They may even say that it is in religion that the height of spiritual experience is to be found. But if you use the concept of the human spirit in a secular sense, that is of the complex of our emotions and our responses to the world and to other people, you can see how these things can be every bit as rich, as poetic, and as important to us as
2 minutes left.
For somebody who is religious. But the key thing is that questions about the origin, the structure, the properties of the natural world, of the universe that we occupy, require no invocation of the intervention of supernatural agencies. Those ideas, the ideas that were once the mainstay of the religious outlook, which claim to give us an account of the origins and nature of the universe, that is now a debate which is, for all practical purposes, over. Because I repeat, functionally speaking, the scientific worldview is the worldview that now operates our aeroplanes, our computers, our lives in general. So only if you accept this separation of domains that we've been offered, and if you think that the domain that religion now mainly lays claim to, that is the aesthetic and moral, can only be entered or enjoyed if you have a religious outlook, then that claim would be, as I've just illustrated, would be false, because a humanist can take those experiences and attitudes as an important part of life.
Thank you very much. So you all raised many interesting issues here, and this is a huge topic, and it's very good. We can have so many different perspectives on this, and and we will see how my questions I have prepared can be linked to what you have said. And my first, and today we're talking about the big questions. Where do we come from? Why do we exist? And what can science and what can religion tell us about this? And what trust should we put in claims that come from either of these human practices? But my first question is actually about the Mars 2020 mission, which I was watching the presentation that NASA showed of the landing of the Perseverance rover on Mars yesterday. This the aim of this mission is to find evidence for ancient microbial life on another planet. And the prospect that the universe could harbor life beyond Earth, I think, raises religious questions about, specifically about human uniqueness. It's about our place in the universe and our uniqueness. Religions typically place humans at the center of a cosmic drama. And my question is, must religions give up the idea of humans as having a central place in that drama and a special relationship to God if there are findings that the galaxy is full of life and that there could be intelligent life many places in our galaxy? So would that challenge the idea of human uniqueness that we find in religion? Or is it possible to accommodate such findings in a religious framework? So, and you can, when you answer this, you can choose if you want to talk about religion generally or if you want to select a specific tradition that you want to address. So please, Professor Pajchel, you can, or should I use your first names perhaps? Katarina.
It's okay. So, yeah, just to share some thoughts on this question. First of all, I don't think this kind of research is any threat, and I will speak from a Christian Catholic point of view. I consider it as just exploration of, if you see it from a Christian point of view, of the creativity and generosity of the creator of the creation. And one could say, who are we should limit the freedom of the creation? So if we find life in whatever form other places, that's just us extending our knowledge of the creation. And creation as such has for centuries been considered as a genuine source of the knowledge of the creator, if we think of natural theology. So it just extends our understanding. But that, and then the question of the special place of human beings, it will certainly change our view on ourselves in the universe. But I don't think it necessarily needs to change our relation towards God, at least if I should speak in religious terms, to consider us as creation, being created by God, that doesn't change, but also the relation towards God as Father, or whatever religious terms one would use, that wouldn't change. But maybe we will become just more aware that we are part of the creation, which is beyond our imagination.
Varadaraja, please.
Well,
your perspective.
First, let me say that I agree very much with what Professor Grayling was saying, but what we need to realize in these discussions is not science versus religion as how the religious view affects human beings today. There is a huge difference between traditional religions and those who adhere literally to the traditional religions and the evolved religious framework today. Every religion has it's not the religion that was practiced and believed in 1,000 years ago. We had those changes. I regard humanism, for example, and I consider myself a humanist, as a modern religious expression. And by religion, I mean, as I was saying earlier, that it is the experiential aspect of being human. That is what I call a religion. The epistemic aspect of being human is what I call science. We do have our sensory perceptions not only give us knowledge, they also give us experiences. So when we consider these experiences, one of them is what leads to various religious views. I personally think that human beings or life form more generally is not unique to the planet Earth. And again, this is, as was pointed out by Professor Grayling again, this is not, this does not belong to pre-modern science, pre-enlightenment kind of worldviews. We have come a long way. And even though it is unfortunate that we have to be fighting still the adherence of people who believe in worldviews that were fashioned 2,000 and odd years ago, we have to cope with them, and it is good to analyze how these things come. And it is in that spirit that I was articulating the views. I don't think any, although there are mythologies in some very ancient religions, including the Hindu religion, according to which there are other worlds where other beings live. You see, and the idea of heaven and hell in Judeo-Christianity also refers to some kind of a different world where different kinds of that human souls reside and so on. But that's a totally, totally different meaning of life elsewhere. So that would be my reaction to this.
Thank you. And Anthony.
Well, on the particular question of life elsewhere in the universe, I think the combination of statistics and chemistry make it very, very probable that there's a great deal of life throughout the universe. The question whether any of it is intelligent life is made more difficult by the question of whether there's any intelligent life on this planet, because we sometimes think, and in a country which has just done so stupid a thing as Brexit, you might call that into question. But from the point of view of the impact of the discovery of life elsewhere in the universe on religion, well, I must say that if any Jesuits are found on other planets, then I would really have to think very differently about my worldview. And I'm sure Katarina would agree. There's one thing that I want to say to Varadaraja, if I may, and that is that I do think we need to be a bit more precise in terminology here when we talk about religion. Because people talk about Buddhism and Jainism and Confucianism as religions, when in fact they don't involve a belief in a god, or some forms of Buddhism now have incorporated a lot of supernatural agencies like bodhisattvas and so on. But this is being superstitious is a very human kind of propensity. I know that the work that you've done, Halvor, is on whether or not we have a sort of a God gene or something in our cognitive makeup that makes us believe in gods. Well, that seems to miss out the entire Chinese population, which on the whole doesn't have that, seem to have that gene. So I mean, we must, I think, be a bit more precise here and say, in my view, and in the book that you mentioned, I argue that we should restrict the application of the word religion to a view which predicates the idea of an interested supernatural being, an interested agency of some kind, interested in our existence and what we do and who we marry and what we wear and whether we cover our heads and so on, and leave the more general term philosophy or worldview to encompass those other ways of thinking about the world, including other worlds.
Okay. Thank you. Well, let us then move on to a very classical episode in the history of science that is often discussed, the Galileo Affair, which also has to do with, well, I guess, with the discovery of things that is happening in outside the Earth. The Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei was famously put on trial by the Inquisition after defending the heliocentric view of the cosmos. And to establish the alleged heresy of Galileo, critics, they cited biblical passages that seem to place the Earth at the center of the cosmos. Galileo responded to this, saying in a letter to the Grand Duchess of Christina of Tuscany, Galileo said that the Bible does not actually commit to a specific view in astronomy. The Bible is a spiritual book about not how the heavens go, but how we can go to heaven in a spiritual sense, how we can be saved and go to heaven. And this, of course, has been discussed a lot. And Galileo plays many roles in these different narratives about science and religion. But my question is whether you think this view that Galileo promoted in this letter indicate a way to reconcile conflicts between science and a religious text. So if there's a text in the Bible that seems geocentric, seems to assume geocentrism, do we solve the problem by suggesting that the Bible is not really a science textbook? It's not really, as Anthony mentioned, that religions are sort of proto-sciences. They have played the role as proto-sciences. Perhaps did Galileo suggest that it's not an attempt to do science at all, and that therefore this provides a way to reconcile new findings with an ancient text. But of course, this can be challenged. And I'm interested in hearing your points of view on this, whether this Galilean solution to a seeming conflict between science and religion works. And if it doesn't work, then what's the main problem with that kind of solution? So, Katarina, you can go first.
Yeah, I think some of our introductions already addressed your question. That and the simple answer would be yes. So from a scientific point of view, it is a very useful clarification. But another aspect of what we have not raised yet is how do we read religious texts? How do we understand revelation? What is revelation, and how is it conveyed? How do we consider the role of human beings in revelation? And that's also a challenge, maybe more towards religious people. How do we read the religious texts? And I think from my point of view, it's and from a Catholic tradition, we acknowledge that the biblical texts are written, first of all, by human beings, but they are inspired. But they are still written by human beings in a particular culture, in a particular historical context. And this very literal reading of these texts is actually quite recent. It was, I think, because both in Jewish and Christian tradition in the first centuries and also in Middle Ages, there was a very rich tradition of interpreting these texts. And there were and even though it was kind of a proto-science, they were never considered as literal texts. There were very sophisticated methods of interpreting these texts. And this very literal way of reading these texts is maybe more inspired, and now I'm just speculating, of a need of reading these texts in the same scientific way as one interpreted experiments. And it's a kind of a way of trying to update our reading with scientific methods, which obviously failed. So I think even today there are rich scripture traditions which can solve some of these issues. And so I think, yes, the answer is that Galileo and many others, I think, point towards a very fruitful way of interrelating science and revelation. And I'm just limiting it, in this case, to revelation.
Oh, thank you. Varadaraja.
Well, this is a problem that arises especially in what are called religions of the book in the Judeo-Christian traditions. Long before Galileo, this question was, I mean, Kepler had said a similar thing about interpreting. And in the Middle Ages, in the Islamic world, there were some brilliant thinkers like al-Rashid, who I think tried to a very similar thing. And these are all, I think, a negative impact of the rediscovery of Aristotle, trying to integrate logic with religion. And Thomas of Aquinas, again, did that for Christianity. Long before that, religion was purely experiential. And as it is for many, many simple people to this day, and that's what I was trying to emphasize in my original thing, that it is not a matter of logical support for what science finds, but it is an extra logical experiential thing, whether it is the love, the joy of love or of music. Those things are what religions are all about. So I think this attempt to interpret religious texts in terms of the findings of modern science, which incidentally goes on to this day. There are Hindu scholars, Islamic scholars, Christian scholars, Jewish scholars who try to reinterpret their holy books in terms of findings of modern science. I personally don't, I am not persuaded, but the fact is that there is this conflict between reason and experience. And that is what I was trying to emphasize, not so much saying which is right, which is wrong, but to describe the human condition that we have always had this. And that's what it's all about. So I naturally, Galileo tried his best to reconcile his findings with he was a good Catholic, and he wanted to reconcile it with his sacred book, for which I respect him. But I think it will be, personally, it will be futile to do that.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, the case of Galileo is a very interesting one, because it is just straightforwardly the case that the Holy Office was very keen to try to resist the idea that the Earth moves, that it flies around the sun. And Cardinal Bellarmine is very explicit in letters that he sent to those who had written asking for the church to try to reconcile its doctrine with the findings of the new telescopic investigations of the sky, when he said the church fathers and scripture both make it perfectly plain. In Psalm 104, God has set the foundations of the earth so that it can never be moved. The sun stood still in Joshua. You know, all these texts were perfectly clear. And Galileo was going to be put to death unless he recanted from the Copernican or heliocentric view of the universe. So it's a straightforward clash. It's the reason why you cite it is because it's a very famous example, perhaps the last effort that the church made to try to stem the tide of scientific thinking. So it is a direct conflict. But in talking of it, Katarina there raises a very, very, very interesting problem, which is that if the scriptural texts for those religions that rely upon scriptures, and I think Varadaraja is quite right that religious traditions which are premised much more on emotional responses or mystic experiences and so on don't have this problem. But if you're a religion that's based on a scripture, then the great question is, which passages are going to be just figurative and which are literal? And you can change the emphasis that you place or the choice that you make about which are literal, which are to be obeyed, and which are just to be regarded as figurative, depending upon your needs. That is the need of preserving the integrity of the religious outlook against any conflicts that scripture has with reality or with the facts. So, for example, today, it's extremely unlikely, for example, that Katarina would stone me to death for not going to church on Sundays, which she's enjoined to do by the Old Testament, which says that they should stone me to death if I don't go to church on Saturdays. So, you know, this business about which of the cherries you pick and which you don't is a real problem for any scripture-based religious outlook. Sorry, I hope that's true, Katarina, that you wouldn't do that.
I was just, can I answer this for this just for the moderator, or would you like to continue? But I would be happy to address, but it's an interesting question, and we will see if it's time to address this later on. I could mention that currently none of us is going to church because of the local rules in Oslo. So.
The moderator is gone.
Sorry, we've lost sound from our moderator now.
Yeah.
Oh, we can't hear you.
The moderator is, we don't hear the moderator.
Yes, your sound is gone, Halvor. The technicians are working on it right now.
This could be evidence of supernatural intervention in our debate.
Yeah. So I could maybe, so I can use the opportunity just to answer. Yes, and very short. This is exactly what I alluded to in my introduction. That yes, theology is this ongoing process of debate, criticism, and it has certain criteria which would actually help us to resolve some of these questions. So it's, well, you called it cherry picking, but I would call it a more of a reflection and quite a systematic one, actually, of how to interpret. And currently also involving literature, archaeology, history, and all sorts of sources of knowledge to actually enlighten our understanding and weighting of these texts.
I mean, it is a very interesting point, isn't it? Because if one were to take a few steps back and look not just at the history of religion or the relation of religion and science, but at the history of ideas in general, at the whole tapestry of the development of the way that humankind has thought about and investigated the world, then you notice that in this great tapestry, the very earliest efforts our ancestors made to understand have very familiar lineaments. They look like some of the traditional religious views of the world. And then bit by bit, with the emergence of philosophy and then the emergence of science, we see a great improvement, in reaction to which those traditions of religion, and indeed the scriptures of religion, have had to reinterpret themselves and reinterpret themselves constantly. This is natural. You would expect that to happen. I think the very great problem is that there are people, as Varadaraja has said, who take these texts literally and who act on them literally. The most sincere believers are the ones who are most scriptural in the practice of their religion. And that,
Hello?
unfortunately and tragically, can be dangerous.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Yes. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened, but so I'm gonna use this microphone for the rest of this discussion. But I could follow your, so thank you for your comments to that question. And I just want to make one comment also about the Hindu traditions has some texts like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and so on. So it seems and they have some sort of cosmology there also. So it's not, I was thinking it also is a religion that is a scriptural religion. It's not only an experiential religion, I guess. So I guess it is still logically possible that there could be conflicts between cosmology inherent in some of the texts of the Hindu traditions and scientific findings. So I was just thinking it's not only the Abrahamic traditions that make claims. I don't know if you agree with that interpretation, but yeah. So
well, the point is, whether it is the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita, there are any number of interpretations of those by scholars. There are, in fact, the whole body of Sanskrit literature. It's called the interpretations, it's the bhashyas, and but they are these works are not regarded as revelations from God, but as what the sages thought, and they're as much philosophical, metaphysical treatises as any other text. So there have been different interpretations. You might have heard of Shankara and Ramanuja, for example, and Madhva. They are all belonging to different schools. They gave totally different interpretations for the Upanishad statements and all. And I think it is important for any tradition, whether religious, as with science, but mainly in the religious traditions, what enriches them is a variety of interpretations and what may be called the intellectual debates. These do enrich the tradition. And that is the way I look at those, not as a great or absolute truths, but as ways in which the human mind grapples with these fundamental questions and offers a variety and often mutually contradicting interpretations of the same.
Would you like to comment that, Anthony?
Yes, could I ask Varadaraja about this, about the rishi, the sages, and the found nature of the Vedas, and the connection between that and contemporary India with the concept of Hindutva and the hostility that some Hindu fundamentalists have towards their Muslim co-citizens, for example?
Quite frankly, I prefer not to answer that question for the simple reason that not being in India, I find it very difficult to really answer a question which is basically more political than theological at this point. And so I do communicate with friends in India who some of whom are ardent in Hindutwas and some of whom are absolutely flabbergasted by what is happening. See, and within India itself, there is huge conflict, and a lot of it comes from, as I see it, the global fear in many cultures where one is afraid that one's own culture is slowly being eroded or intruded by other people. And these are reactions to political and human events. And not being part of a society whose members are experiencing these, I find it difficult to make any value judgment. I'm only sorry to see that things have come to a situation where, whether in India or anywhere else in the world, people have to come to fight with each other about their own religions and the integrity of their own culture and so on. It's become a sad spectacle in the saga of human history. But beyond that, I cannot say anything very specific.
So let's, thank you. Let's move to a final question before we go to the Q&A session. And I have a question which connects with what Varadaraja has said about the experiential aspect of religion. I'm interested in the epistemic value that religious experience might have. And I'm interested in research on religious experience. And there is a lot of research currently on the neurobiology of religious experience. And one example is a study conducted by the psychologist Michael Persinger, where he exposed human brains to magnetic fields using a helmet, and this helmet later became known as the God helmet. In this study he conducted, many of his subjects reported experiencing a sort of presence. But I know that this has been tested. It has been tested on some well-known atheists like Richard Dawkins, who reported not feeling any presence. but some people reported that when the brain was exposed to the magnetic field, they reported that there was something there. They had a feeling of a presence. And my question to you is that then, what if anything can this type of research, it doesn't have to be this study, but this type of neurobiological research on religious experience, what if anything can it tell us about the epistemic value of religious experience? And by that I mean the ability of religious experience to produce or give rise to knowledge, or to provide us with justified beliefs, for example, about the existence of something supernatural. Does neurobiological research challenge or undermine the epistemic value of religious experiences? So, Katarina, you can start.
Well, I think so. You're touching upon an area which I think will be one of the most interesting in the future, in reflection on religious experience. And from my point of view, I think there is a long tradition in Christian and at least in Catholic theology to acknowledge the place of nature as the very foundation and the space of revelation and religious experience and interaction with God. Thomas Aquinas was famous about this, of stating this, that grace presupposes nature. It doesn't extinct nature. It's not against nature. So grace or relation with God is not erasing our human nature. It sort of presupposes it, and that's what makes us, what our human constituents are part of our relation with God. And in this sense, it's open towards this new understanding of what this nature is, and that our brain, our physical physiological functioning is part of that. My only question here is that, well, I very much applaud all this research, and I'm very interested in it. The only danger I see with it, and where I would sort of oppose a bit, is when you enter a very reductionist interpretation of this research. It's the moment when you see religious experience is only firing in your brain. So I don't fear the insights we may gain. But I'm willing to discuss the interpretations, and especially those reductionist interpretations.
Thank you. Varadaraja, your perspective on this?
Well, I'm not a neuroscientist, although I have talked about this with a few people, and I've read Damasio's books and so on. My own feeling is that the human brain definitely responds to different kinds of stimuli. And I think whether when you are watching a sports program or listening to opera music or enjoying a joke, different parts of the brain lights up, I mean, putting it crudely. And it is not surprising at all that when one is having a religious experience or is in meditation, another part of the brain or some part of the brain responds in some way. I do not know whether this proves or disproves anything, but this is a natural consequence, it seems, of how the human brain responds and reacts to stimuli.
Thank you. So neither of you think there's challenges?
So I can answer this by telling you very quickly a little story. I have a very dear friend who is a neurologist. And one day into his clinic came an elderly gentleman who said to him, I think I have had a minor vascular accident in the occipital region of my right cerebral hemisphere. And my friend thought to himself, hello, somebody's been on the internet and doing a bit of self-diagnosing here. So he said to this elderly gentleman, he said, why do you think that? And the elderly gentleman, who turned out to be a professor from the local university, said, because in my left visual field, I see these human forms floating up out of the floor and passing through the ceiling. And this is diagnostic of a small stroke in the primary visual center in the occipital region in the brain. And when they did a scan, there indeed was a little blood clot. And when the blood clot had resolved 2 or 3 weeks later, these images of human forms vanished. Now, if this man had not been a professor at the local university, but if he had lived 500 or 1,000 years ago, he would have seen Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad floating up out of the floor instead of thinking that he'd had a stroke. And this is a perfect example of how some illegal substance or a passionate encounter with somebody you like, or banging your head against the wall or having a few drinks can give you something which is awfully like a religious experience. I'm afraid I'm on the reductive line of argument here, Katarina. And when Varadaraja says, if you have a religious experience, your brain or part of it lights up, I think it's the other way around. I think if your brain lights up, you have a religious experience, or could do.
Yes, please,
yeah.
please go
yeah.
ahead.
So the question, I think, would be also how far can we follow this reductionist path? Because I would also follow it quite a long way, but it's just that I would still keep that there is a irreducible experience, and that's maybe it's not even so that's but it's perfectly true that you experience things which may stimulate your what you consider a religious experience. But I think it's an important that our discussion would maybe where we disagree is whether there is a irreducible part. I guess that's because yeah, and it's an interesting question, and that's what makes us, yeah, well, that's where faith also comes into picture.
Well, could I mention, I mean, Katarina, I agree with you that if you and I got together and we both had a little cigarette of marijuana together, and we both started to have religious experiences, they might differ because of our psychological histories and because of our emotional makeup and so on. So what you refer to there as the gap, so we have a reductionist explanation about neural activity and different regions of the brain being activated, but then there will be some other factor that comes into play. And I agree with you that you may very well not be able to effect a remainderless reduction, which is the same in every case, so that you in the fMRI scanner and me, there might be different regions of the brain or slightly or something. This could do with our psychological histories.
Definitely. And I think what's interesting in this debate is that we can follow each other's arguments quite far, but also, and I think the reason why we can have an exchange on this is that even though I claim some irreducible experience, I would still be very critical in my assessment of that, and I would still try to follow as far as possible rational arguments as far as they can allow me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. You said, when I said when you have a spiritual experience, the brain lights up. And you said, no, it's the other way around. When it lights up, you have. No, that's a matter of how you describe it, because one can be induced. When I go into a yogi goes into meditation, he intentionally provokes a reaction in the brain. So it is not, or if somebody has a revelation, certainly without one's knowledge, that happens. So we don't know, we can't say that it's always which is the cause and which is the effect. In other words, like your example of marijuana, you can cause it externally. Ultimately, it's a matter of, putting it crudely, it's a matter of brain chemistry, whether it can be altered through drugs or through meditation, I don't know what. That's what gives us the impression of reality of whatever kind.
So I think we'll do, because we are a bit over time because of the technical issues. So if that's okay with you, we will do one more question and then Q&A, then the Q&A. So does that sound okay? Or maybe it has been, I was just interested in the concept of spirituality, which has been mentioned here. Does spirituality have to be tied to religion? Or could the appreciation of the world as it is described by science be considered a sort of spirituality? So the reason I ask this is because many scientists who are atheists describe the universe and nature with a sense of wonder and awe, and they describe the search for truth, for scientific truth, in ways that suggest to me that they have it is not only that it might be a spiritual activity. But my question is, could that be a sort of spirituality, or does spirituality have to be tied to the belief in religious teachings? So please, Catherine.
Yeah, so I think I will answer very shortly, and no, I mean, no, I think there could possibly be. I don't remember your question, but I mean, but I think I would confirm that yes, I think there may be a spirituality based on human experience, as we say, or of science, of art, of relation with other person, which sort of awakes in you this wonder. And I think that we touched upon this, maybe more universal experience of the holy. So yeah, which is maybe not, which you find in different cultures. I'm not saying religions, but there is certain universal experience of this something very different, or the holy, or whatever expression we would use. Maybe also spiritual, one could say. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, I am aware of, and even at one time participated in, spirituality linked to particular religions, especially to Hinduism. There is, but I personally don't think it has to be, needs to be. I have been practicing meditation for many decades, and during that time, I simply surrender myself to my cosmic ignorance of all the grand mysteries of the world. And I, in utter humility and reverence, I contemplate on my ignorance of the cosmic mysteries. To me, that is the only spiritual experience that I can claim to have had. But I also know and I respect the spiritual experiences that people affiliated to particular religions have. And so it changes from person to person and from context to context.
Thank you.
Well, we all rather wonderfully agree here in answering no, that the kinds of experiences people refer to when they talk about spiritual experience don't have to be associated with the religion. So one can dispense with the word spiritual and talk about the poetic, the aesthetic, the profoundly emotional experience, the very way that people can be very deeply moved by the beauty of nature, or the kindness, the gentleness of another person, or the sacrifice that somebody makes for other people. These things can be very profound and very moving indeed. And the richness of our overall intellectual and moral response to the world and to other people, which is what I think sometimes people talk of as a kind of spiritual experience. And the sense of the numinous, of the oneness of things, the fact that there are very, very significant connections between people and the world around them and the universe. These are things that non-religious people, that an atheist like myself, for example, can tremendously value. And we can seek to commune with others and with nature in order to have these experiences, because these experiences are very refreshing and recreating of ourselves.
Well, thank you. So, also in this case, this is a view where science and religion shares something, I guess. In this case. Okay, so I think that it's a time that we take some questions from the audience, and I'm going to read some questions for you.
Orange juice.
So the first question is from Ole. He's saying the theme of ISFiT this year is creating knowledge in which there are certain implicit assumptions. For the entire panel, are moral truths assuming that they exist, created, or discovered? No, so are moral truths assuming that they exist, created, or discovered? This is for all the panels, so you can, yeah. Katarina, if you want, you can go ahead, or any of you.
Well, perhaps I could jump in there.
Yes.
This question could be slightly rephrased into, are there objective moral truths? Or are they just entirely a matter of our subjective responses to things? And to take the latter view might be promoted by the fact of relativism. So different moral outlooks seem to disagree with one another in how they value. In my view, there are certain objective fundamentals in thinking about morality, which arise from very, very basic facts about human beings. There are very, very few human beings who like to be cold or hungry or in pain or alone. And those human beings who do like those things are weird. So we know if we see somebody in pain, we see somebody cold and hungry, we know how we should respond to them. And these are facts which seem to me to be objective facts that underwrite a great deal of the moralities that, in fact, if we investigate them, we really do share around the world. And in that sense, our moralities are objective, at least in their foundations.
Yeah. Thank you. And also, any of the rest of the panel?
I think I could follow up this, and I would also agree that there are some fundamental objective truths, moral truths and values related to the human being. And in that sense, I wouldn't claim that religion or Christianity, to be precise, is in a sense necessary or a guarantist for moral laws. I think we can argue towards very much the same rules without. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, to me, I don't personally use the word moral truths. I refer to them as principles. And moral principles are principles that enable individuals or instruct individuals or guide individuals in their behavior towards fellow humans, fellow creatures, and the environment at large. And therefore, these change from individual to individual, culture to culture, person to person, age to age, historically speaking. And so that would be my view of moral principles.
Yeah. Thank you. So let's keep our responses short, because we have a lot of questions, and hopefully we will be able to get through more of them, many of them. The next one is from Jacob, and it's addressed to Raman and Pajchel. Why do you think that only religion can address questions of value and meaning? Or maybe this has been addressed now, I guess. In my opinion, religion can give a contribution to these questions only in the form of telling us what somebody once thought about these questions, but obstructs further progress and discussion of what constitutes a good life. I guess we need to rephrase that a bit to... let's start with the beginning. Why do you think that only religion can address questions of value and meaning? Or do you in fact say, I guess in relation to the previous questions, it seems you do not say that only religion can address. Do you want to...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Can you?
Why do you think only religion can address questions of value and meaning?
And it's addressed to all, or
it's addressed to Raman and Pajchel.
Oh. Well, it cannot be addressed to me, because I never said that only religions can do this.
Yes, so I think, yes.
I don't believe that.
It seems you, yes, as you answered previously, you don't really say that. So I think we can move to the next. We will move to the next question. This is addressed to the panel. Would you say religion helped trigger the Enlightenment? I am here referring to Islamic philosophy, which introduced the idea of the human ability to rationally know God to Europe, right before the Enlightenment. Is that clear?
I think this is a question more of history of science, in a way, and it's I think my answer is that it's I think there is a need to rediscover and acknowledge also the contribution of Islam, and actually long before the Enlightenment, I would go back to the 12th, 13th century, where there was a very fruitful sharing of knowledge in Spain, and how Islam also brought back the Hellenistic heritage into Europe. So I think it's a question of maybe gaining more nuanced knowledge of history of science, and actually see the various the contributions also from Islam, but and Christianity and Judaism, and but acknowledging this, I think we may find reasons to argue that this rational tradition of these three religions, in a way, made an important contribution towards development of science and later on enlightenment.
Will the rest of the panel is interested in responding?
Well, I will say that in the golden age of Islam, relatively early in the history of Islam, when open discussion, criticism, and different interpretations were encouraged, translation was encouraged, a great service was performed by preserving aspects of Hellenic culture, certainly philosophy, some of the major philosophical texts, especially Aristotle's texts, but also mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. These things were preserved as well. So that was a very valuable contribution there. No question about that. You have to remember that contemporaneously, of course, and indeed for much longer before, huge advances in technological development were being made in China, quite independently of any religious commitments or traditions. And it is a very mixed picture because, as I mentioned in my early contribution, for a time anyway in the 17th and in the 16th and early 17th century, the church, by which we mean really the Roman Catholic Church as it had become after the Reform, actively tried to oppose some of the developments in the natural sciences. So you sometimes see a more open, a more liberal approach. Sometimes you see a more reactionary approach. But overall, I think the long story is that in the end, none of the religious traditions have really been able to prevent the growth of scientific knowledge.
And I may also add that enormous advances in mathematics, including the discovery of the notion of zero and basic algebra, went from India to the Islamic world once it was translated into Latin and into Europe. So there have always been interactions and mutual enrichment of cultures. And there is, as far as I see, no need to claim that any particular culture did a lot more than any other. We have all mutually enriched one another over the ages in the past, until, I would say, the emergence of modern science, when something radically different happened.
Although one could add to what Varadaraja just said there, that India gave us 0 and China gave us gunpowder. And I would prefer India's nothing to China's gunpowder.
The next question is addressed to Sister Katarina. It's from Thomas. Do you experience some kind of opposition to your beliefs in your day-to-day work? In simpler words, is it hard to be a Catholic physicist?
I think the short answer is no. I've been quite fortunate to have very open-minded colleagues, and which I'm very grateful for. And but yes, I have also tried to be open to and fair in my or to preserve some integrity in the interaction with our field of work. So I haven't personally experienced any opposition, no.
So the next question is from Nicolina. It is addressed, I guess, to the whole panel. It can be said that religion provides meaning and answers to big questions that science is not able to, like mortality. I am wondering if religion in some cases can be a way to avoid finding answers to these big questions for yourself, or to disclaim responsibility. When is religion healthy, good, and when does it turn unhealthy, negative, or bad?
Can you repeat the second part of the question?
So the second part is, when is religion healthy, good, healthy or good, and when does it turn unhealthy, negative, or bad? That's the second part. I guess you can choose if you want to address all of it or parts of this question.
If I may, I'll just address the first part of the question on meaning. You know, the great contribution of the Socratic moment in the philosophy of classical antiquity was addressing this question of meaning. Sometimes I'm asked by taxi drivers what I do, and I say, well, I'm a professor of philosophy. And so the taxi driver says, well, in that case, you can tell me what the meaning of life is. And I say, yes, as a matter of fact, I can, because the philosophical tradition from Socrates has told us what the answer is. And the answer is, the meaning of your life is what you make it. The assumption that there is some external one-size-fits-all meaning, which is the same for everybody and it comes from outside us, is exactly what Socrates wanted to challenge when he asked his fellow Athenians what they meant, what they understood by the fundamental concepts, the nature of the good, of generosity, of kindness, of truth, and so on. Because he wanted them to realize that they have to think, how can I live? How should I live in such a way that my life is meaningful? And then, of course, one of the things that one recognizes in connection with one's individual responsibility to answer this question is that one is a social animal. One must be connected to people around one, and that therefore the possibility of a really good life rests upon the possibility of really good relationships. And out of this comes, I think, some of the very best thinking there has been about what a good and meaningful life can be.
I could maybe connect to the point of this responsibility which you mentioned, because even if you then, if part of that making sense of your life is to follow a religion, I strongly believe that it never suspends this responsibility for your choice. So even if you so you have a moral responsibility even when following religion, and therefore I think this continuous reflection and rationality and is still needed when, even if you choose a religion as your way of seeking a meaning. So, and I think that's maybe answering this question, when is it healthy? When does it turn bad? I think suspending your responsibility, just referring to I did it because my religion told me that, is maybe questionable. So you will, even a religious choice has to be made in a conscious way and does not free you from a responsibility. So I think this connection with rationality and being able to defend your choices is very important, this sense of responsibility and freedom. And when religion denies you that, I think it may turn unhealthy.
Because Katarina is obviously such a lovely person, I very much dislike disagreeing with her about anything. But I will just push back on this point if Varadaraja will allow me to jump in before him and just say, in Christianity, one of the greatest sins is the sin of pride, of thinking that you can do it on your own, that you are actually dependent. You need the grace of God to help you and so on, that you cannot, you are not capable of being completely responsible. That's one thought. And then of course, Islam means submission. It means obedience. So there is a big difference between the Socratic kind of humanism, which says you have ultimate responsibility to make these choices and to create meaning, and religious views which say, actually, we're not competent to do it.
The way I see it,
provide us that Varadaraja can provide his response, and then we should move to the final statements. That's
okay. The meaning to me is somewhat like eating food. What is the meaning of eating? To me, that makes no sense. Every food, every time we take food, we enjoy it. So every act, every interaction, every action that we do has meaning. But overall totality, meaning is not necessarily a fruitful pursuit. It's very meaningful what we are doing right now, our engaging in this discussion. But this will recede to something else when I am listening to some music or having lunch or whatever. So meaning, there is no such thing as meaning for life as a whole, but every single moment can be made meaningful.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your interesting perspectives and comments to both my questions and the questions from the audience. So I now invite you to make your final statements about the topic we have discussed today. So, so a couple of minutes, a short final statement from each of you. So please, Katarina, you can go first.
Okay, so I'm very happy that we have shown that there are areas where we agree, and there are also, I think, very sound sound disagreements here, which we could go on discussing. And I think it's a point which struck me preparing this for preparing for this discussion is that the title of it is Beyond Reason, and I would hope that even with our very different contributions and starting points, I hope that we could bring on this experience that maybe we don't really need to go beyond reason, but maybe the very basis of this kind of fruitful I hope fruitful dialogue, I experienced it at least as very fruitful, is exactly in our common search for and respect for reason, and our efforts to actually express our faith, our knowledge, our experience, whether religious or more scientific, in a way that is shared and which is accessible to other people's reasoning and may actually also inspire their thinking. So I'm left with this question: do we need to go beyond reason, or is there actually more to gain by reaffirming the importance of reason?
That's really something to think about. So, Varadaraja.
Yeah. The way I see it, the value of a discussion like this, whether or not we as individuals like one religion or another, or don't accept any religion, the fact remains that there are millions of people in this world, millions, who are affiliated to various kinds of beliefs and disbeliefs, religions and sects. What we need to do is to channel all their positive potential. And I say positive potential because many of these people, from personal experience, I know, and we all know, many of them are decent, good people who are committed to doing only good things for others, caring, compassion, and all the humanistic virtues they have. What we need to do is to try to respect and enable people to respect the positive elements of their own beliefs and practices, and equally to encourage them to respect the beliefs and practices, the non-hurting beliefs and practices of other religious people. We cannot eliminate religions from the world, and we don't have to propagate religions in the world. We need to learn to respect other people and relish in the joy and the positive experiences they derive from their religious beliefs. And at the same time, to understand and respect what science is all about, because we are entering a very dangerous age when people don't understand the greatness and the importance of science for human life and human enlightenment.
Thank you very much.
Well, it has been a real pleasure to engage with my two fellow panelists, who are both lovely and very sincere and very thoughtful people, and I've enjoyed their contributions. So on our very particular point, which is about the relation between science and religion, I see this as a relation of difference. And the chief difference is that science is not so much a body of knowledge as a methodology. In fact, if we had world enough and time, we would recognize that we're not talking about knowledge, we're talking about rational theory formulation on the basis of which we can premise our actions and our further investigations, and that all scientific claims are defeasible because they're all responsive to evidence, to the outcome of observation and experiment. And so science is a method. In the case of religion, Katarina has pointed out that there can be extremely sophisticated rational arguments, the use of reason and logic and so on. But the distinctive thing about religion is that there is a point ultimately somewhere where an act of faith is demanded of people, that they have to commit to believe something, perhaps even in the very face of counter evidence, which after all is regarded as a theological virtue. Look at Doubting Thomas. Blessed because he had believed, even though others had believed without seeing, but Doubting Thomas had to actually see. I suppose he was the first scientist and got into trouble for it. So there was a big difference, I think, between the two. And that is a difference which it's worthwhile to reflect upon, because it's a difference that doesn't speak to other things that we've addressed in our discussions this evening about the aesthetic, ethical, emotional response that we have to the world. I think we've all agreed that you don't need to be religious to have those responses. And in the end, those responses and the sincerity with which we conduct our inquiries are the most important things about us.
So thank you very much, all of you, for your very interesting contribution to this debate. So I wish to thank you, all of you, the panelists. And I also wish to thank the audience for attending and for providing their questions, very interesting questions to you. And I would like to thank the people here at Studentersamfunnet in Trondheim. A big thanks to videokomiteen, forsterkerkomiteen, sikring, fotogjengen, vertskapet, and regi. And with that, I thank all of you for your participation, and hopefully we can meet again and discuss these very interesting issues on next time. So,
thank you
very much.
Thank you. I think I will leave it now.